Okay, this is a history on 1301 history, and this is a lecture on the Quakers of Pennsylvania and western New Jersey. So today we pick up with the third of four the great English-speaking folkways, or the English-speaking settlers to English North America. We've already had the Puritans, we've had the Cavaliers, and now we take up the Society of Friends. They're commonly known as the Quakers, but for us, we should also call them by their real name, which is the Society of Friends. The Quakers of Pennsylvania are going to be religious refugees for the most part. They are coming here for religious freedom for themselves, and in many respects, like the Puritans, they had no concept of freedom of conscience for the sake of, for all, or just simply for the sake of the freedom of conscience. They believed in freedom of liberty, but at the same time, it was really particularly restricted to themselves and to others like them who could be similar. Now, they were more inclusive than, say, their Puritan neighbors to the north, but at the end of the day, also, they were very distinct in their ideas on religion. The Quakers of Pennsylvania, of course, are English predominantly, but you will have Scottish Quakers, you will have Irish Quakers, you will have Welsh Quakers, you'll even have some Quakers who come off of the mainland of Europe, and or just an associated sort of tribe. I say tribe, but movement or sect. The thing is that Quakerism is part of this larger pietist movement of the 1600s, and so that's really where we pick up. Quakerism was founded by George Fox, himself no highborn man, but he had these series of visions and ideas, kind of a mystic in a sense, where he believed that organized and I guess you could say traditional religion was problematic at best and frankly maybe heretical at worst, and that the best way to go back to the true founding of Christianity, and Quakerism, to be clear, is Christian in its general concepts, is to go back to the model of the early church. And that is nothing unusual. And if you have ever grown up around churches or grown up around people or grew up in a family that was particularly pious, you will get that drift every so often of we need to go back to the New Testament church. And you see this here with Quakerism as well. So anyways, the Quakers, the Society of Friends as they're called, or sometimes you'll just see them cut off as friends. The Quakers get their nickname, and at first, by the way, it was a slur. Something you need to be aware of, and I'll point out from time to time in this class and in other classes I teach, is that sometimes what is affixed to a group as a slur becomes a badge of honor. Not unlike, say, the term Hoosier, like for the Indiana Hoosier, University of Indiana, the Hoosiers. Hoosier is actually a slur toward that Scotch-Irish group that is going to settle Indiana, and is not meant as a compliment. In a more modern sense, think of it this way: the phrase oil-filled trash. That was the one I was reaching for. Oil-filled trash that you may even see on trucks from time to time. It was meant initially as a slur, but over time, there's no formal moment. It just kind of happens. But the people who are in the oil field as workers or whatever, they just have heard it before and they take offense, or more particularly, they say, you know what, we are. Maybe we are that. And so they put it on their pickup truck and they go into the oil field in the Permian Basin or around Bryan College Station, whatever. Some of you probably have seen that before, and you have seen that phrase on the back of a pickup truck normally. Anyways, the same with the Quakers. The reason they're called the Quakers is because of particularly the moments of ecstatic excitement that could take place in their meeting houses. These Quakers could come under the Spirit, so to speak, and they might shake violently, hence the term quake. Could be almost like a Pentecostal, second anointing of the Spirit sort of thing, where you have the speaking in tongues and what have you. So there was a very much a spiritual aspect to Quakerism and its religious practice and so on. And so I guess when we talk about the Quakers, we ought to talk about their piety, their spiritual practice. As you might expect, a group of individuals who are trying to go back to the way it was back in the pristine past of the New Testament are going to strip away many of the accoutrements and the offices of the new of the church as they understood it at that time period. You're not going to have bishops. You're not going to have meeting houses or churches that are adorned with stained glass or all of the trappings of not just the Roman Catholic Church, of course, but also the Anglican Church, which was very much like the Roman Catholic Church. And they would even have trouble with some of the Puritan practices of having, or Presbyterian practices of having ordained clergy, trained clergy, and so forth. In some respects, like I said, this is very much a stripped-down organization. The church itself would be very, very plain on the interior, perhaps even more plain than some of the more pious Baptists that you might come across in later years. But several basic theological things are worth noting here to separate them out from the Puritans or other groups. Number one, they believe they put a heavy emphasis on the Spirit. They put a heavy emphasis on the Spirit. Christians and Christianity has always had this kind of dual notion, and you see it in the theology around Jesus, that he was fully God and he was also fully man. And he was not superior God and inferior man, but he was both fully. So there's kind of a dual aspect. You see the duality at times in the New Testament in the way it's taught by Paul or John or some of the other writers of the New Testament. The fact of the matter is that some Christian sects will put or denominations, if you prefer, will put a heavier emphasis on the body and the flesh and what you should and should not do there. Others will put a heavier emphasis on the Spirit and downplay the effect of the flesh. And they are less excited about that. Perhaps, it depends on the denomination, depends on the person. It's hard to say that there is a right way, in a sense, and I take this as an observer of Christianity and of a lifetime. Each person is very determined and dogmatic on what they believe to be right, and so you just let it be at that. I mean, I have my opinions, and you might have yours, but at the same time, the Puritans were trying to be kind of balanced. They push up the flesh, but they also talk about the Spirit, whereas the Quakers are going to lean more to the Spirit side and downplay the flesh. And the Anglicans would be, I would argue, the other way, downplay the Spirit and bring up the actions of the flesh. And so you see all these sorts of things at work. Also, in addition to the playing up of the Spirit, you would also be fair to say too is that the Quakers do not believe really in the total depravity of man. They really did not like, and they despised in some cases, Calvinist theory and thinking. They were opposed to it totally, so in some respects, especially, say, the total depravity idea that man is irredeemably wicked without the saving grace of Jesus. Not to say that the Quakers believe that everybody was good. They don't, because they can see the sin around them. But yet at the same time, there is an optimism that you find in Quaker circles with regard to the Spirit and the regard to the actions of the Spirit, particularly when it interacts with the Spirit of Jesus, that is far more optimistic than you get with the Puritans of Massachusetts. And so when we say that, it's fair to remember too about the Quakers is they believe that everyone is born with what you can call in your notes an inner light. And it is that inner light, that inner soul, as it were, that spiritual light that each person has that connects them to the inner light of Jesus. Not bodily connected to Jesus, but again, to that idea that the Spirit is played up to the detriment of the flesh. They put a heavy, heavy emphasis on that. They believed that everyone had an inner light. In fact, it leaks, that sort of phraseology leaks into their language when they talk about lights. The lights of, I guess you could say the lights of Germantown, Pennsylvania, or the lights of Elizabethtown, New Jersey, or whatever. The thing is that when they talk about lights or they talk about little kids, they talk about little lights and adult lights and whatever. They don't really, they raise children, but they never really think of children quite like a Puritan or certainly like a Cavalier does. So these are the lights, these little lights, and this light and that light. So anyway, we've got the Quakers in their philosophy there. Something else that transcends and comes out of their beliefs and thinking is that unlike the Puritans who would fight, whether it's as Roundheads in Cromwell's army, or they would fight amongst and fight against the Native Americans in their midst there in Massachusetts or Connecticut, which, by the way, the natives of Massachusetts, Connecticut were generally speaking not peaceable, so there was going to be tension. I sometimes you get the drift that both of the settlers were all looking to pick fights with the natives, and that sometimes is certainly true, but the natives in North America weren't pacifist either. However, the Quakers are pacifist, and that's really what you need to note. The Quakers of Pennsylvania, the Quakers of western New Jersey, south and western New Jersey, they are pacifists, almost to a man. So that one of the major characters and a very important man in the American Revolution, who was a right-hand man to George Washington, arguably one of the best generals in the entire Revolution for the American cause, was a guy named Nathaniel Greene, whose nickname was historically the Fighting Quaker. He did not renounce violence, and when the Revolution came, he put on a uniform and took up arms against his enemies, the British or the English. And in consequence, Greene got kicked out of the Quaker Church, as it were, for his actions. And ultimately, Greene is going to be very influential, very important, dies shortly after the American Revolution is over, but that's a famous example of someone who goes against the thinking and the actions of Quakerism and what should be done and how one should react and act and so forth. So Quakerism has a pacifist angle, meaning I will not fight. In fact, actually, it's worth remembering, too, that Quakerism is the first of several sects, denominations, beliefs, and I mean this, casting a net wider than just Christianity now, but one of several sects that have effectively a conscientious objector status, that if you choose not to fight, you would be respected and allowed to sit out the war if a war comes and a draft is necessary. It's not always respected, but it is there, and really from the earliest days of the Republic, you see, even during the Revolution, you see pacifist sects standing aside, and it was just okay. Not everybody loved it, not everybody accepted it and celebrated it, but they tolerated it, and that is true for the Quakers. World War I's a little different story when you talk about that, but different era, different time. So Quakerism, again, does not begin in the United States, but it begins in England, and George Fox is the founder. But for us, talking about American history and these settlers coming here, the man who's really going to help get them to come in numbers is going to really help organize and get the Quaker nation coming to the Delaware River Valley. And you probably ought to write that in your notes. It isn't just Pennsylvania that is the Canaan land for the Quakers. And when I use that term Canaan land, if you're familiar with the children of Israel, when they talk about the Canaan land, that is the promised land. That's an allusion to the Bible, the Old Testament. It is, in essence, saying the promised land for the Quakers is the Delaware River Valley, which would include parts of Pennsylvania. But the man who is going to help bring and send all those Quakers over here, and this man is going to, before it's all said and done, the Great Quaker Migration sends 23,000 friends to the Delaware River Valley, is William Penn. Now, compared to the other migrations, the Quakers are kind of small. I mean, there's thousands to be sure, but it's never quite the 100,000 that you'll get with the next group, the Borderlanders, or some of the other two, the Puritans and the Cavaliers. But 23,000, that was a good-sized immigration, and they come. And it's worth noting, too, is let's talk about William Penn, the namesake of Pennsylvania. William Penn is, in the sense, a bundle of contradictions. He is highborn, whereas many of the Quakers who are going to join the church are not highborn. You will find rich Quakers, you will find wealthy Quakers, and especially as Quakerism matures and I would say, goes into decline and eclipse in Pennsylvania in the 1700s, you find extravagantly wealthy Quakers. Sometimes they'll trade the piety for the money, and sometimes they'll try to be both. But the Quakers, many of the Quakers who are going to immigrate to North America, they aren't very wealthy. Some of them are very, very poor. But Quakerism, actually worth noting, draws from all walks of life. Unlike Puritanism of North America, unlike the Cavaliers of North America, the Quakers are all over the place. You see them from everywhere. You see them, in fact, actually from many different parts of England. Unlike, and I really haven't made a big deal about this in the other lectures on the English folkways, but all those other groups, they have definite places they come from. East Anglia, greater, the London lowlands and so forth for the other two groups. Here you see kind of the middle lands is the great breeding ground for the Quakers, where they get their most settlers coming to Pennsylvania, to western New Jersey, and along the Delaware River Valley. The thing is that, however, all that said, is though they may come from the middle lands up north of London and below the Scottish border, the fact is that you find Quakers from all over the place coming here. So in that sense, it is very diverse as well. So the Quakers, as they come to North America, they're going to be led by William Penn. Penn himself, like I said just a second ago, was a bundle of contradictions. He is a wealthy man coming from wealthy stock. He marries wealthily, and yet at the same time, Penn is going to be very much associated and concerned with the plight of the poor. He is born not just to wealth, but he's also born into a war-making family. Yet he becomes a pacifist. He was a great swordsman. In fact, one of the more famous aspects of his life early on, he was, I think he was traveling in England. He may have been in France. But this Frenchman, and the basics of the story is this French swordsman attacks Penn, and Penn was so adept at his handling of his own weaponry, his own sword, that he disarms the Frenchman and basically takes the Frenchman's sword away. In true chivalrous fashion, almost like Knights of the Round Table territory, he spares the man his life and walks off, wondering why would anybody attack me over some sort of basically tradition or event. So anyways, he had a pacifist streak in him. He is that as far as Penn is concerned, he is going to go to Cambridge and Oxford, yet at the same time he dresses in some of the, and which is highborn sort of stuff, yet at the same time he dresses in some of the most common fashions. He is going to be despised for his faith, yet at the same time, he can be sometimes very tolerant, at least in his early days, of those who weren't so faithful. Yet at the same time, he can also be scandalized what he saw at Oxford, which drove him deeper into Quakerism, and it drove him into the arms of George Fox. People who saw Penn did not always appreciate his religious convictions. He grows up and by the way, his family served both Cromwell and the Crown. Penn will be also very close friends with Charles II, a king of England. And it was Charles II who's going to give Pennsylvania its name. Originally, Sylvania was the name of the colony. The colony of the Quakers was supposed to be a holy experiment in the Quaker way, kind of as a example to the rest of Christendom to how to live and to live as in emulation. Yet at the same time, it was Charles II, who was not a Quaker, to be clear, is going to put on the charter in his own hand, instead of just the word Penn, rather Sylvania for the colony, he added the word Penn. Penn will be married multiple times. A couple of his wives die, and it was his wealthy wives who were going to help bankroll the colony to get it off the ground. So it's all over the place with William Penn. But he suffers for his faith. I think you really ought to write that down. I think you need to know that. He suffers for his faith. And many people who are trailblazers, who are going against the flow, are going to suffer for their faith, whatever their faith may exactly be. If you're talking in Christian circles, it's very clear in the Bible that those who are going to follow Jesus in their particular way, especially if it's outside the mainstream, can suffer slings and arrows. Marvel not that the world hates you, John says in his letter. So that's there. And in the case of the Penn family, they were distraught. Can't believe that he became a Quaker. They can't believe he joined the Society of Friends. So what they try to do is Penn's father basically is going to use different methods to get his son to quit being a Quaker. He had his son whipped. A father had his son whipped for being a Quaker. He had his son turned out and thrown out into the street for being a Quaker. And in fact, actually for a period of time, Penn will be thrown into jail by his father for a better part of a year. I think it's actually 13 months for being a Quaker. Yet at times, William Penn looks like he's wavering, but he stands firm. And eventually his father relents and sends him off to college. Then that scared Penn all the more about the impiety of the world around him. And so Penn keeps on going. After he becomes a full-fledged Quaker, after he is his own man, he is going to preach. He's going to preach in lots of places. He's going to go as a missionary. And he preaches outside of locked buildings, locked Quaker meeting houses. He gets arrested on several occasions. In 1670, he was arrested for a second time, basically within 2 years, for violating conformity and unity acts in England for preaching without a license for all intents and purposes. And he was tried for these violations, and he defended himself as his own lawyer. He was his own attorney. And there's a saying in American jurisprudence that goes like this: the man who defends himself has a fool for a client. But that wasn't the case in William Penn's setting. William Penn was so convicting and so persuasive as an attorney, even though he was defending himself, that the jury that sat in judgment of him was so moved that they refused to convict him for violating his conscience and violating the laws of England particularly. Even after the jury itself was being threatened by the judge and by the government for their refusal to take up and for their refusal to find Penn guilty. The government was leaning heavily on that jury to do the bidding, and they wouldn't do it. Even after Penn was acquitted, he's going to be arrested again and charged, this time in a secret star chamber sort of setup, meaning a secret trial, not by jury of the peers, not in the public, and he will be convicted, and he spends time in jail for it. And because he's Penn, he could have, and because of his high-born status, Penn could have received preferential treatment at the Tower of London, which may not have been a five-star hotel, but at the same time would have been better than what he did. But Penn took on the common garb, and he said, no, I will be with my people. I will be a commoner. And so there he was. And he got along famously with his jailers. They respected him. In fact, some of them idolized him while he was in jail, which, by the way, is a common theme about Quakers going to jail. You could throw them in jail, but they tended to be very, very good prisoners. They'd clean the place up. They'd take care of things. They were model prisoners. And so, in a sense, the persecution didn't affect them. They were, I don't want to make them sound like they were robots or anything, but being a Quaker meant that persecution probably was coming, at least in the early days of Quakerism. And Penn and his people are going to suffer the slings and arrows and do it with not just a stiff upper lip in the English sense, but kind of a happy joyousness because they know they're doing the right thing and their understanding of their theology and belief. Oh, by the way, while he was in jail, he wins the hand of a wealthy woman. It's his first wife in 1675, I believe it was. And, 1672. Dates don't matter. I'm just remembering them off the top of my head. And then he also strikes up a friendship with Charles II while in jail. And Charles II eventually makes it Pennsylvania, as we already said. But William Penn will suffer for his faith, and it's just pit and parcel for the Quaker way to suffer. All of which is to go on to say is that Penn's going to be the ramrod behind the settlement of Pennsylvania, western New Jersey, the Delaware River Valley. And these people who are coming, they cut a different figure. Obviously, religion is the main driving force, but these people are sometimes given the impression that they are pacifistic in not just warfare, but they're just tolerant of everybody. That would be wrong. Please put that in your notes. These people are not tolerant of everybody and everything. They are not, live and let live, accepting. They don't believe in that sort of stuff. Again, sometimes we like to take our enlightenment ideas and our enlightenment values, as you might say, and transpose it onto the past and say they should have done this and they should have done that, and this group did it just like we would have done it. For the Quakers, and especially Penn, they would have, like I said a minute ago, they never would have considered religious liberty for the sake of religious liberty for all, but for themselves and people like them. That was for their thinking. But yet, oh, by the way, William Penn, while he's in jail, writes several books, one of which is on the case for religious liberty, which is one of the greatest defenses of religious liberty in the English-speaking world. All of which is to say is that they're quite complicated and they're quite fascinating at times to look at. They can also be quite boring, to be clear. They can be very, very plain and boring. When they get here in the 1650s is when the Great Migration starts of the Quakers to the Delaware River Valley, but it really comes in earnest from 1675 to 1715. That was when those 23,000 settle into Philadelphia and so on. The thing is with the Quakers is that they have a specific way they want to do things. Let's take, for example, marriages and so on. They're not as dogmatic of getting the kids married at an early age as the Puritans, and neither are they as lackadaisical and cavalier-like like the Virginians are. Average age of marriage is in the 20s, and their view of marriage is different. It is a set and prescribed process. And really, maybe the word for your notes should be process. If the Anglican marriage is a sacrament, which it is, and if the Puritan marriage is a civil ceremony and a covenant, which it is, you could say the Quaker views of marriage is that of a process. It is about a 16, 17-step process to getting married in Pennsylvania. And you had to execute all these different things. You had to make announcements. You had to post those announcements. You had to go to families. You had to pay a fee occasionally. You had to do this. You had to do that. And finally, then the last step of the marriage ceremony isn't in the church or the meeting house at all. The last step of the marriage is going to be when you are at a dinner and you leave the dinner at the last step of the marriage, you leave together as a husband and wife. And then in Quaker eyes, you were formally married. These are love matches in a sense. They are certainly more equality-minded than the Puritans and definitely more equality-minded than the Virginia Cavaliers. And if you say, why is that? And the answer should be in your notes is because what matters more, the flesh as I pinch my cheek, or is it the spirit as I rub my breast or my chest? The fact of the matter is that it's the spirit. And remember this about the Quakers. They believe that if the spirit matters, then this is more just kind of a transitory sort of thing. This is not something that matters in the long run. It's what's in here. And so this is, to use a term, the flesh is only skin deep. So you have, in that sense, a much more broad, and especially compared to other groups, a broad-minded, to say, that's loaded, but a broad-minded idea of equality between man and woman. So anyways, when we say the Quakers and their relationship between man and woman, it's certainly there. Also to keep note of as well, the Quakers do not have the interest in the physical relationships as do the Puritans or the Cavaliers. We've already established that both the Puritans and the Cavaliers, in their own way and in their own justifications, reasonings, and practices, had few or very few hang-ups with regard to sex. Particularly the Puritans within sex within marriage. The Puritans, they had no issues there, basically. And the Cavaliers, especially the males, it was within and without marriage. The marital bed, sex could be performed or be had. For the Quakers, on the other hand, if you thought that the Puritans were anti-sex, and of course you would be wrong, the Quakers really probably who you were thinking of. The Quakers believed in sex for procreation at most. And in fact, in some more pious senses, some Quakers bragged in their diaries and journals, this is worth noting, just to give you an idea how radically different they would be from other Englishmen and things that they would do that might help bring on their some persecution in a sense. I mean, this is not going to be probably the major thing, but it would be looked upon as strange. Samuel Pepys, talking about William Penn, said, "Oh my gosh, he's become a Quaker. How melancholy, how bad." And Samuel Pepys, who was a diarist in that time period, did not appreciate Quakerism, to say the least. But anyways, back to marriage and sex within marriage. For a pious Quaker, they might even abstain from sex for 2 or 3 days, maybe even a week after being married. The wedding night was not explosive or fireworks or anything like that. It was very different in the Quaker movement. So for them, it's fair to remember is that and that's going to have consequences for the culture. It's going to have consequences for the community, because if they are restraining themselves and simply saying, you know what, a good pious Quaker has sex for a marriage, has sex for the procreation of children, and basically that's where the list ends at, you're going to have a lot less kids. Now, Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Valley could be very deadly at times. Yellow fever sometimes did strike in Pennsylvania. It did strike in Virginia occasionally as well, but Delaware River Valley was never as bad as Cavalier, Virginia, but it could be a sick place. And so between just natural mortality and the progression of diseases that would sweep through a territory in the pre-medicine era or pre-modern medicine era, plus the low birth rate, and I don't mean like 2020 low birth rate where 1.7 is the common number nowadays in the United States, but you have a lot less kids, especially compared to Puritan Massachusetts, where you had a lot of kids. Down in Pennsylvania, not so. So they're going to have a very strict coda. They have a very strict lifestyle. And so, by the way, I want to be clear about this as well. If you violated their moral code, if you went against what they thought was proper and good, they could punish you pretty harshly. They weren't afraid to apply the rod of the law, or the sword, as it were, to use a term out of the Bible, the sword of the law, the sword of the government, to correct and to protect. And some commentators would say that Quakerism was more legalistic in a sense than was Puritanism or Cavalier practices. So there was a holiness factor in the way they would do it. Now, when you did have kids, these married couples did have kids, and sex outside of marriage, by the way, is frowned upon, to say the least. But when they did have a marriage and they did have a kid, these Quakers are not going to treat their children as little saints, or little sinners, I should say, or little savages, as a Puritan would. They're certainly not going to apply the rod nearly as much or as liberally as the Puritans. The Puritans had no hang-ups about correcting a child. But the Quaker, on the other hand, would say, oh, hang on a second. No. And so remember this. I used the phrase at the outset of this lecture, the little light. Again, this flesh stuff is just temporary. It's transitory. It's skin deep. And what matters is the interior. And they generally have a more, like I said, optimistic view of the man, meaning the soul of man, that he is eminently capable of doing good and being good. And so instead of trying to beat the sin or to beat the hell, and I mean that in a theological sense, to correct a child into the right ways and the admonition of the Lord like a Puritan might, a Quaker was far more apt to go along the right route of, don't do that, reasoning with the child, begging with the child, pleading with the child. And some of you, maybe not many of you, but some of you probably grew up in a household where mom and dad really never raised a finger to you, never applied either a swat on the bottom or a belt or any of the punishments we talked about with the Puritans. The fact was the Quakers, they were, generally speaking, opposed to corporal punishment. They did not believe in whipping a child, as it were. And so they rear their children very differently. You see even with the boys and girls an equality aspect as well. And it translates itself in this way here in their religion and their religious practices. Here's one example of several. First, in traditional Christian practice, and some would say that Quakerism is unorthodox. I'm not here to argue those points, but I will say this is that for the longest time and in most circles, even to this day, at 2020 at the time of this recording, it is not okay for a woman to be a preacher. Now, there are denominations like the Methodist, like certain branches of the Presbyterian Church, Episcopalians and others, maybe an independent church, some Pentecostals and so on, that have no compunction about ordaining a female minister, a woman of the cloth, as it were. But even today, that's a controversial subject in some Baptist churches. There's no female priests in the Catholic Church, and on we can go. In 17th century America and Quaker practice in 17th century America and Puritan visits and villages and such, it was absolutely forbidden and off the charts wrong for a woman to be a preacher. Or for that matter, famously in the case of Anne Hutchison, for a woman to be a teacher of men. You can say, how does that work out, and why would they say that? Some of it is tradition. A lot of it has to do with in the Bible. There's really no ordination of women in the Bible. You don't see the laying on of hands of women like you do with Paul or what have you in the New Testament church. All of which is to say is it's controversial. And the Quakers, because of their issue of their belief in the heavy emphasis on the spirit versus the flesh, they are going to allow women to be and encourage women to be, put this in your notes, traveling missionaries. Now, again, you may think, well, don't some Baptists have traveling female missionaries? Well, oftentimes you see them in the form of missionaries being missionaries who are married, especially if there's an issue of ordination and teaching and what have you. So there's some subtleties in that. But when I say traveling missionaries, I'm talking about a woman who would travel in her Quaker garb, and they've got a distinctive dress coda as well. I mean, think of the Quaker man on the oatmeal box, and that's kind of accurate, actually. Think of some of the hats, the flat hats, and black and white was very common for them. They were very bland and boring, kind of like oatmeal is, and so on. But for this woman to go traveling off and becoming a missionary, and they sent many women from Pennsylvania to other colonies to preach to the masses, as it were. A woman to go off and preach in other parts of the English-speaking colonies could be quite dangerous. Could be dangerous for the woman in the sense that she could be arrested and imprisoned and just frankly beaten up. Famously or infamously, I guess it actually would be better to said, would be is that the Quakers sent this one woman. She was a missionary, and I don't remember her name, and I don't know that I've ever read it, but she goes to Massachusetts, and she goes into Puritan, Massachusetts. I think it was maybe Braintree or something like that. Quincy, but not Boston, I don't believe. But anyway, she goes into Massachusetts. She starts preaching in town. She's a woman, and that was not okay. And so the town folk, particularly the local constable, the law enforcement for the era, they arrest her and they treat her roughly. They beat her, frankly. They take her out of town and they tell her in no uncertain terms, do not come back into town. Your preaching and your sect is not welcome here. We don't want Quakers in our town. Get out. Well, they left her, and she picked herself up, kind of wiped off the blood off of her face and the bruises as best she could, dusted herself off, and then she marched promptly right back into town and began to preach again. And then they hung her. Down the road in Cavalier, Virginia, a similar sort of story, another female missionary preaching Quakerism amongst the Cavaliers. She was arrested. She was beaten. Then she was thrown into a metal box, which was more or less like a cage where she was compelled to kind of sit on all fours in order to be in that cage. She was put in the middle of town, and people came and men urinated on her. Women threw feces out of their chamber pot upon her. She was cussed and spat upon, and like I said, bruised and bleeding. She was taken out of town and dumped roughly and told not to come back. In this case here, this woman did not. She did not go back. So what I guess I'm saying is that the Quakers, for all their piety, could also be very controversial in the way they acted and worked. A Quaker meeting house, like I said a few minutes ago, was a very, very simple affair. It is segregated actually or separated by sexes. For people who did not put a heavy emphasis on the idea of differences between sex, so the thing is that they would do that in their worship practices. They generally had two doors, and if you look behind me, you can see the two doors in my barn door bunker here, and you can see, just imagine if there was a door behind me like you can see, and there was a door in front of me that you could not see. The women would enter on one side, the men would enter on the other, and then they would sit down, and they would face each other with oftentimes a hollow space in the middle. As I have indicated to you before, And maybe I ought to put this on an exam. I don't know. I probably would. But at some point, if you think about it, architecture, you can kind of tell what the most important part of a building or a public meeting room is. It's wherever, however you set up the city council, or however you, in a religious sense, where do you put the pulpit or where do you put the altar? But there is no pulpit in a traditional Quaker meeting house. There is no altar in a traditional Quaker meeting house. It is a plain room. And the men and the women face and stare at each other. And then there they sit. And they sit in quiet, and they sit silently, and there is no order of service. It's not like if you've gone to the local Baptist church and you walk in the door and the ushers hand you a bulletin. It's not like at the local Catholic parish where you walk out the door after Mass is over and they hand you the bulletin. There is none of that. There is no order of service. And so there they sit, and then they sit quietly. And famously, sometimes they sit for a very long time. And when it comes to these sorts of things, a famous ecumenical, meaning interdenominational confab, I guess you could say, took place in Philadelphia in 1775. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, who was a son, as it were, of Philadelphia, and was it John? Yeah, it was John Adams. All three of those founding fathers, they go to a Quaker meeting house because this is the outbreak of the Revolution, and they're trying to make sure the Quakers stay on the sidelines and are not trying to hinder the Revolution. The Quakers weren't going to fight for the English, probably, but you don't want them trying to sandbag you in a non-military sense. So these three men went, and they sat in the Quaker meeting. Quakers allowed visitors. And so there they sat in silence for an hour and a half. And then they got up, and then they left, meaning the three founding fathers, Franklin, Adams, and Washington. And nothing had been said in an hour and a half. Nothing had been sung or anything of that nature. And what are the Quakers doing? Sometimes they're waiting for the Spirit to move. Frankly, they're waiting for the Spirit to move. And so the idea would be meditative, prayerful, sort of introspection. And then as the Spirit moves, you stand up, and then you start to speak. And it was regardless of sex. One could stand up and exhort, be like an informal lay preacher. Would stand up and say, the Spirit has moved my heart, let me tell you this or that. And so they would preach, maybe for 5 minutes, maybe for 20 minutes. And then kind of like a waterfall or a cascade, then somebody else would stand up, male or female, doesn't matter. And they would preach and exhort. And then sometimes these things just keep rolling on, and you may have a 3-hour meeting. You may have a 1-hour meeting. And oh, by the way, sometimes the meetings never, very little, if anything, was ever said, and the meeting just broke up. And the thing about the Quakers is that you will read in their diaries, and they too kept diaries, not as prolifically as the Puritans, but they kept diaries, and you'll see these Quakers comment that we had very good meetings today. It was very good services, essentially. God was near us, and they said nobody said a thing, but that was very close. They're, like I said, very pious, very mystical. They kind of have that. They're very spiritual in their own way. And so these meeting houses, these Quaker meeting houses, will be all over the place. Their food is fairly bland. It's a traditional English fare for all intents and purposes. Their burial practices were similar to the Puritans in the sense they got the corpse in the ground rather quickly. But at the same time, this is worth noting too, far more so than the Puritans or the Cavaliers, and this may have had some real legacy in the northern United States and even the southern United States. At the time of this recording, and the reason I'm recording this lecture has to do with the ripple effect of the COVID-19 virus. And I have read probably more than I needed to read on the virus during the summertime of 2020. And one of the things that you would see, especially even in the springtime when New York was getting pummeled by the virus and so many people were dying in New York from the virus, is that you would read these laments in the New York Times and elsewhere about how we did not get to see Grandma and Grandpa. We did not get to see Mama, or if she was in a nursing home or a hospital, we couldn't say goodbye to her. We couldn't be with her as she died or she passed. And that is that was kind of, to me, as I was watching this, and you knew a lot of people will want that. You want to be there in the room when your loved one goes on. And the thing is that that hasn't happened. And the modern era, perhaps, that we live in, I had kind of thought perhaps that was not as much of a desire as it maybe once was. I think it still is. It's just a human desire. But some cultures, going back to the Quakers, want to have a better handle on the passage and want to know about the passage. And you see this actually in the Civil War diaries and Civil War letters about the good death. That's the phrase you might ought to use in your notes, the good death. And the Quakers were clearly proponents of the good death. Maybe more so than any other particular group in North America, at least English-speaking North America, and beyond just the big four that we'll mention. They believed in the idea of the good death. And so for them, what they looked for is that they wanted to know, and this was maybe the best-selling set of books in Quakerism. The Quakers never put as heavy an emphasis on the Bible as the Puritans ever did. And so they never made that was never quite the bestseller for them. But books on death, that was really the wheelhouse for the Quakers. What was it like to die? Well, how did this woman die? How did this man die? And the best stories for them, the Quakers, when they felt like there was real spiritual growth to be had and that there was real spiritualism to be seen, was when a woman or a man who was dying had their eyes literally or figuratively fixed upon heaven, fixed upon Jesus, the inner light, and going back home, as it were, and not fighting death. They didn't do everything they possibly could do to forestall and prevent death, and they did not struggle against it. Their piety was assured. They were ready, and they went, and they died, and they passed on, and they were good. And that was the basic outline of those books, is that the good death. This person died in this manner, and these things happened to them, but yet at the same time they never lost hope and focus. And so you see that those were parts of it too. But also it's fair to say maybe something else that has some legacy of the Quakers. And the Quaker legacy is actually kind of limited because of the numbers and the lack of growth that they had. The other groups grew quite well. This group maybe not so much. So one of the things is that their language. If you actually look at their language and the words that they use that got into the more common American vernacular, the more common American English, you find the Quaker phraseology popping up in my language and your language and so on. But here's just some that you might write down. You don't have to write them all over, but here you go. If you ever said, I couldn't budge this truck, it was say the truck was stuck in the mud. We couldn't budge it. Budge, B-U-D-G-E, that is a Quaker phrase. A burying. You ever heard somebody say, I'm going to a burying? That may not be as common in a city or coming from that, but I've heard it out here, meaning in the country. We're going to a burying today. Well, that's another Quaker term. So blather, anybody just blather along? Empty talk. By golly, and I will sometimes when I am having some fun in class and I really want to use a stronger word, but by golly, for the Quakers, that was an expletive. They did not cuss. They did not cuss. They believed in watching their language. By gum, that was another one of their phrases. And so other phrases that you might hear, and I've used, and some of you have, you chuck something over the fence, toss it over the fence. Chock full, meaning completely full. Clear, clean for entirely clean. So clean gone. A clump for a clod. Cotton, to cotton on. Cuddle for caress. Some of you have cuddled with your loved one. A crib for an infant. Oh, let's see. How about dither for being upset? A dresser for a chest of drawers. Drat is drat that person. You expect something for suppose I expect that so. Actually, I've used that one quite a bit. Might have been on this lecture today. Let's see. Flabbergasted. Flare up. A fuzzball. Gabby, being gab for talk. Oh, you can go on that list. Thingamajig. See, homecoming for a return. Let's see. Guzzle, to drink greedily. Some of you may have guzzled beer this past weekend. Let's see, gawk at something, staring at something or somebody that walked by that completely surprised you and maybe scandalized you. I don't know. Let's see another one. Ginger snap is a type of cookie. Good grief for an expression of surprise. Let's see, grub, Grubhub, grub food. That's Quakerism. Anyways, on and on I can go. Sucker for sugar candy. Spuds for potatoes. Let's see. slammed to put down with violence. I mean, there's a whole bunch of phrases, some very common, some a little less so nowadays, but those are all Quaker words. Those are all Quaker phrases that got into the larger American English and beyond, of course, but some of their legacy here. The thing as we draw this to a close now is that, by the way, Quakers, let me take a couple of other things. One, as far as the Quakers are concerned, as far as learning is concerned, learning and education, they were in favor of education, but they never loved books like the Puritans. They never just went after books. I mean, I know I mentioned the stuff about the good death, but that's the exception rather than the rule. If you look behind me, you can see all the books stacked up all over my office in the Barndo bunker. The Quakers would be scandalized that I have spent as much money as I've spent on books, and you can't even see the upstairs that I have in the Barndo bunker that I've got is basically like a library up there. So I've got a lot of books. So I guess when I die, Caroline's going to have to clean this out. I feel sorry for her because there's a whole lot of books here. Some of that have value and some that don't. But anyways, all of which is to say, they believe that, a small library was good enough. 5, 6, 10 books, read them thoroughly, know them, that's fine. They believed in education, but not education in the sense just for reading and writing and arithmetic. I mean, yes, they did that, but they believed very heavily in practical education as well, like what we might call vocational or CTE, was it career technology and engineering, or CTE education, but basically shop class and that sort of thing. They believed that was a very valuable tool. They hated wasting time. They were very industrious, and they went to work. Elbow grease is being very industrious. That's another phrase that they used, and that comes from them. But anyway, so they were not time wasters. They hated gambling. They hated games. They could be quite disparaging and discouraging. And to act like they were just clean and pure as the wind-driven snow, No, they had their own ways. They had their own ideas of the society that they wished to set up and to see others to emulate them. But ultimately, kind of like all these groups, you have to say what happened to them. For the Quakers, what broke the back of Quakerism is just simply the rigorousness and the seriousness by which they took and expected others to take their movement. For many people, it's nice to hear about, and you can get all misty-eyed when you hear about the Native Americans along the Delaware, and the Quakers all got along in some sort of kumbaya thing, which, by the way, the natives along the Delaware River Valley, they themselves were pacifists, so that makes it a lot better. It makes it a lot easier to be a pacifist too, frankly. The thing is that the Quakers, their lifestyle just was not attractive. They never had enough kids to really grow the movement, and they never could attract members into their colony in a sense like, don't you want to be a Quaker sort of attracting? Proselytizing is another word. So by the time you get to 1756, that's a good year for you. By the time you get to 1756, barely over 100 years after the first Quakers showed up in Pennsylvania, the Quakers lost control of Pennsylvania for good. They're going to be dominant figures, and they're going to be dominant Quaker families in Pennsylvania and western New Jersey going into the 19th century and even into the 20th century. But at the end of the day, they lose control of the colony because they just simply didn't have enough numbers. And Philadelphia, which is in a sense, the capital and the hub of Quakerism. Think of the name Philadelphia, by the way, the city of brotherly love. It kind of gets the Quakerism in a sense. But Philadelphia is also not just a hub of travel and trade amongst the colonies, but it's also a deep seaport because of the Delaware River Valley, and it just waters down and breaks up the concentration of Quakerism there in that territory. So that ends us on the Quaker lecture, and we move on to the Borderlanders, which is a rocking and rollicking, very different group than the Quakers we've just finished. Thank you.